Senate Majority Leader Thune, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thanks, Tristan. Great to be with you.
It is great to have you. Unfortunately, we have to start on this devastating news out of New Orleans, this terror attack. You have now been briefed. It claimed 14 lives. What is the latest information that you have about the investigation?
Well, horrible news, obviously, and our hearts and prayers go out to all of the victims' families, those who are still injured, praying for their recovery. But what a horrible way to start the new year. And it points to the need to get the answers and to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think that as more information comes out and the investigation is more fully completed, I think we'll have more of those answers. But clearly it's a dangerous world, and I think it's a reminder that we need to be doing everything we can at every level to keep the American people safe.
Well, President-elect Trump and House Speaker Mike Johnson have linked the attack in New Orleans to the border, and yet the attacker, according to authorities, was American, was born in Texas. Do you acknowledge that the attacker was in fact an American, was born here?
Well, that's my understanding. And again, as we get more information, I think we'll know more of the details. But I think that the broader issue here is that in this particular circumstance, whether he was a citizen, which appears that he was or not, we have a very precarious and dangerous situation at the southern border. And I think created by policies during the Biden and Harris administrations, which essentially created an incentive structure where people just wanted to come into the country, and they waved them in. And I think there's just a sense around the country of uncertainty around that. I think people look at what's happening around the world too and see a very dangerous world. And I think that's why they are looking for a different path when it comes to America's national security interests, and that's why they voted for President Trump.
But you acknowledge that this attack was not connected to the border.
Well, again, as far as we know, this was somebody who was an American citizen, like obviously an American member of the military, and but it needs to be handled in a way that there is full transparency about all of that, and that the American people know exactly what happened. But then I think, again, the lessons we have to draw from that are what do we do now to protect the American people going forward?
You said in your statement after the horrific attack in New Orleans that the threat posed by ISIS, quote, is a clear example of why the Senate must get President Trump's national security team in place as quickly as possible. As you know, there are Senate Republicans who say they still have questions about the qualifications, about the character of some of President-elect Trump's picks, from Pete Hegseth to Tulsi Gabbard. As we sit here today, are you prepared to vote yes on all of his nominees?
Well, it's a process, and we're gonna. What I've promised them is a fair process, and so these nominees are going to go through a committee where they get they're going to have to answer questions. There will be some hard questions posed. We're going to do everything we can to ensure that he has the people he wants in place. I think you give great deference and latitude to a president when it comes to people he wants to put into key positions. And national security ones are especially important. But the Senate has a role, advice and consent. And we have a lot of our senators who take that role very seriously. And so we will make sure that these nominees have a process, a fair process, in which they have an opportunity to make their cases not only to the members of the committee and ultimately to the full Senate, but also to the American people. And that's underway as we speak. But my hope and expectation is that the president will get the people that he wants in place to implement his agenda.
And I hear you say there's a process, but you're not prepared to say you're a yes, you're a rubber stamp on all of these nominees at this point.
Well, that's why we have a process. And, I've met with them. There are some of them I think that I've been really, really impressed by. And I think there are, as they go through the process, there will be opportunities throughout that where senators will have opportunities to make sure they're getting their questions answered, and we'll see. I mean, I think this is again, that's why we have the checks and balances in our system that we have. But my expectation is, and as the leader in the Senate, that we're going to get the president, his people, as quickly as possible in the key positions where he wants them.
Let me ask you about Kash Patel. In his book, as you know, as has been reported, he has a list of 60 people he calls members of the so-called deep state. Are you certain that Kash Patel's priorities would be fighting crime, protecting national security, rather than settling political scores?
I think that he understands what his mission would be if he is successful in getting confirmed to that position at the FBI. The FBI is an agency that I think is in need of reform. And needs a good makeover, so to speak, and probably a good amount of house cleaning when it comes to just the perception the American people have of it. And these institutions that the American people need to have confidence and trust in, I think that confidence and trust is largely eroded. And there's an opportunity to fix that. I think that's what I sat down and met with him. I think he understands that's the mission. And if he's successful through the nomination process, I hope that he will take very seriously that responsibility and focus on what he can do to make the FBI operate in a way that is protecting the American people and also being accountable to the same.
When you say you think he does understand the mission, does that mean, yes, you do think he will put national security ahead of settling political scores?
Well, in my conversations with him, and I've not talked a lot about the meetings that I've had, but I felt like he fully understood, I think, what is expected, and I think what the president wants out of the agency. I feel confident that he gets what his job is going to be if he gets over there. And I think that as he goes through the process, more members will have an opportunity to ask the questions of him. But I think at least based on my conversations with him, I feel very good about that.
Are you a yes on Kash Patel?
Well, I'm not, I haven't been advertising or disclosing my positions on individual nominees at this point just yet. But my job is to make sure they get a fair process. And so I intend to do that, and I think that's underway.
As we are sitting here today, the House is choosing its next speaker. President-elect Trump has endorsed Mike Johnson to continue to serve in his role as Speaker in the House. Do you think that Mike Johnson is the best person to serve as the Speaker of the House? And what do you say to those who oppose him?
Well, I mean, I think the House is going to decide. I try not to interfere, and I'm not sure that my endorsement of anybody would be helpful. I try to stay out of the House's decision-making process over there. But I've worked closely with him, and in my experience, and I haven't spent a lot of time with him just yet. But as I've sort of evolved into this new role, had an opportunity to see him in action, and I feel very confident that we could have a very strong working relationship if that's ultimately what the House decides to do. Do
you think he's been an effective speaker so far?
Well, I think he's got a really, really tough job, and yes, I mean, I think he has been responsive to his members, but he's got a lot of folks that are headed in different directions. I mean, as you know, that with a narrow margin like that, any individual member of the House of Representatives can have a huge impact, and I think what he has to do and has been doing is figuring out how to balance that. And I give him deference to how he runs the House. He understands the House. I don't. But I do think that they will need to be, and we will need to be as a Senate and with the White House, working closely as a team if we're going to get an agenda done that we want to accomplish for the American people.
You take me to my next question. Let's talk about the Republicans' agenda.
Yeah.
When I spoke with President-elect Donald Trump, he said that his mass deportation plan was his top priority. He wants to deport everyone who is here illegally. Do you support that plan to deport everyone who is here illegally?
Well, I think there are certainly there are categories, people who have committed crimes. There are over 1 million people that the current administration had targeted for deportation. And so I think that we have to take seriously the fact that there are a lot of people in this country today, over 10 million, who've come in just in the last 4 years under this administration's policies, many of whom are not here for good reasons. I mean, we know we've apprehended almost 300 people at the southern border. They're on the terrorist watch list. And you've got criminals and cartel members and gang members and all of the above. So I think that as we think about what those next steps are, the first thing is securing that border and making sure that we change the incentive structure so people are incentivized to come here illegally, which they have been for the past 4 years, and that we do everything to ensure that the border personnel, the ICE agents and border agents have the resources that they need to do their job. Now, some of that means physical barriers, some of it means technological barriers, et cetera, and those are all going to require resources, and then some is going to require deportation of certain people who are here illegally. How that gets translated into actual policy and action will be a function of the new Border Czar and Homeland Security Department Secretary, who will be our Governor, Kristi Noem.
And of course, it's incredibly complicated. You need 24 more times ICE detention capacity just to deport 1 million people in 1 year, not to mention more agents, more judges. more planes for deportation. In 2016, you actually said deporting everyone here legally wasn't realistic. Have you changed your mind about that? Do you think it's realistic?
I think you've got, again, I think you start, and I think this is going to be obviously a process, and it's going to take resources, obviously, to get people, to leave the country. We're going to have to make sure the administration has the resources they need to enable them to do that. Is it realistic to deport everybody? I mean, there's a lot of people in this country who are here illegally. But I think we have identified already, and I said anybody who has committed a crime in this country clearly ought to be on that list. And there are a bunch of folks that over 1 million, 1.4 million, I think, on the current administration's list of people that need to be deported. So start with that, and then we'll go from there and figure it out. But I think that the administration, when they take office, these are decisions obviously they're going to have to make, and we want to work with them to ensure that we have a safe and secure southern border where people don't have the incentive structure they have today, which is essentially come to this country and we will wave you in. People have to understand that we are a nation of immigrants, but we are first and foremost a nation of laws, and you got to follow the law.
Let's talk about tax cuts. President-elect Trump has proposed a slew of tax cuts, extending the 2017 tax cuts, as well as further slashing the corporate rate, eliminating taxes on tips. The estimated price for everything he's proposing would exceed some $9 trillion. Are you comfortable adding $9 trillion to the national debt?
Well, I think you have to, first off, look at what happens if we don't act by the end of the year. And that's a $4 trillion tax increase on the American people, because that's essentially what you're talking about if we don't extend the 2017 tax law. The president has had some other suggestions and ideas with respect to, that he would like to do in the area of tax reform, and we'll take those into consideration. But I think that we intend to ensure that we don't have a $4 trillion tax increase on the American people by December 31 of this year. And in order to do that, we've got to act collectively, House, Senate, and White House, to extend the 2017 tax cuts. Now, in doing that, I believe there will also be a robust conversation about whether we can find offsets and achieve reductions in spending that would help offset some of that. But then also, you've got to understand, too, that tax policy is directly connected to economic growth. And we've been told by all the experts, the Joint Committee on Taxation, Congressional Budget Office, that for every 1% increase in GDP, you generate about $3 trillion in additional tax revenue. Many of the tax provisions that are in law today that will be extended will have a very positive impact on growth in the economy. I'm somebody who believes in growth. With growth, you get better paying jobs, but you also generate more tax revenue. And I think that's something that isn't fully contemplated or considered when people talk about deficit numbers.
You've said that the size of the national debt is actually a national security threat. You're talking about the 2017 tax cuts, but when you lump all of these other potential tax cuts onto it, it just balloons the debt. How would you pay for that? I hear you expressing some skepticism that the whole entire package could get done.
Well, I mean, I think that you start with extending existing tax policy, and that is current policy. Now, some people, depending on which scorekeepers you use, will say, well, yes, this is going to contribute to deficits down the road. But the fact of the matter is, this is the law today. And
so
what you're doing is essentially extending that.
Offsets?
Well, I'm not perhaps all of it, but what I'm telling you is a combination of growth, a combination of offsets, and an expectation, I think, that if you want to avoid a $4 trillion tax increase, you're going to have to take some steps to extend the current tax policy. When you do that, I think you get outcomes that are good for the economy. And when the economy is growing, expanding, and creating better paying jobs, people are making money, they're taking realizations, they're paying taxes, tax revenues go up. And that was demonstrated and proven in 2017 with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Monday marks 4 years since January 6th, since the attack on the Capitol. You were here that day. You've been in this building for more than 20 years. In my interview with him, President-elect Trump said he plans to pardon those who attacked the Capitol on that day, and potentially even some of those who pleaded guilty to assaulting police officers. Do you support that, pardoning people who attacked police officers who stormed the Capitol that day? Well,
I mean, as we've discovered under the Biden administration, the pardon authority is a very broad one. I mean, he's taken it to a whole new level. That's ultimately going to be a decision that President Trump is going to have to make. And, what I'm focused on is the future. and not looking in the rearview mirror, but looking at the windshield and what we have to do. I think you learn from the past, you remember the past, but you live in the present and the future. And right now, we have an agenda which consists of a stronger, more robust economy, energy dominance, rebuilding our national security and securing our border. Those are things that we want to get done, which I think the American people voted on in November and gave President Trump a very decisive victory. And I think the expectation is that we're going to work with him to accomplish that agenda.
As the majority leader in the Senate, though, what message do you think it would send to give pardons to people who pleaded guilty to attacking police officers who stormed this building 4 years ago?
Well, look, I mean, again, it's ultimately going to be a decision that the President of the United States, the pardon authority exists with him. My job right now is to help the President get the people into the positions that he wants to implement his agenda, and then work constructively with him, with the House of Representatives, on an agenda that we think is what the American people voted for. And that, you know, you can't be looking in the rearview mirror to do that. You know, that's 4 years ago. I think the American people are living in the present, and I think they want the work that we're doing to be done with an eye toward what we can do and improve their lives today.
Quick little lightning round, if I could. President-elect Trump told me he is open to doing a deal with Democrats to protect Dreamers, those who were brought here illegally as children. Do you commit to working with Democrats to try to get a deal on the Dreamers?
Well, if the President of the United States, he's obviously going to lead on a lot of this policy with respect to the border. But that is an issue that I think on which there could be some bipartisan cooperation. In the past, at least, there have been conversations around, if you get the right things with respect to border security, that might be part of a conversation where you could get a package.
You, in your speech on the Senate floor, expressed the fact that you will defend and protect the filibuster. Does that mean, even if it means you cannot get all of President-elect Trump's agenda through Congress?
Well, the filibuster is, as I've said, essential not only to the Senate, but to the country. It provides, and this is what the founders had, they wanted the Senate to be a place that was hard to get things done. And I say it's inefficient by design. Now, it takes 60 votes to do most consequential legislation in the Senate. And that requires a certain level of bipartisanship, which gives a voice to the minority. And the filibuster, I think, protects the country from whims that come from total majoritarian rule. And so yes, we're going to protect the filibuster. And, but there are some things that we have to get done at 60 votes. Appropriation bills, we got to do a new farm bill. There are a whole range of issues. There are some of which, that, as I've mentioned, we can do 51 votes through reconciliation, which is something when you have the House, the Senate, and the White House, you can accomplish. But for the most part, most of the agenda requires 60.
Mr. Trump says that he can get a better deal than Obamacare. Is that possible, or is repealing and replacing Obamacare off the table? Just quickly, I have one more question.
Yeah, and I think the president has some ideas on that, and we're willing to work with them. I think what you want for the American people on health care, Obamacare has increased costs for everybody, is you want more choices for consumers, and you want a competitive marketplace where when there's competition, it drives down prices. And so if there are ideas that the president, the administration have around those concepts and incorporate those ideas, then we're open to them. But, obviously we want to do everything we can to make sure that the American people are getting good value when it comes to their health care choices.
I just finally, big picture, want to ask you, you endorsed Tim Scott during the Republican primary. You ultimately backed Mr. Trump. How would you describe your relationship with President-elect Trump right now?
Well, you know what? It's evolving. And we have a relationship, I think, where we understand what each other wants to accomplish. And what I said before is, that there is an alignment of incentives. We want to get to the same destination. I want a lot of the same thing, to accomplish the same things that he does. And I think that's a powerful combination, and we're going to continue to build on that.
What's the mark you want to leave during your tenure?
I would like to see us as a nation do things that affect the long-term stability, future of our kids and our grandkids. And I think a lot of that right now, we're in a fiscal mess, $35 trillion in debt. But I think first and foremost is protecting the country. I always tell people, if you don't get national security right, the rest is conversation. We have to defend the country. And so military readiness will be a big priority for me, because without it, you can't protect the American people. And then I think a lot of these issues, these economic issues, have serious consequences. And $35 trillion in debt and growing by the day is something that's going to be is not a legacy that we want to leave. And so if we can do things that grow and expand the economy, create a better paying jobs, a better future for those kids and grandkids, and at the same time try and rein in and get a lot of the spending under control, make government more efficient, distribute power out of Washington back to the states and local governments and the American families, I think that's a good outcome. So those are the things I'm interested in.
Senate Majority Leader John Thune, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Kristen.
And
Happy New Year. Same to you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.